Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Griffin. I'm from the University of Newcastle and I'm going to give you a guest lecture today on the study of animal cognition and its applications to solving some real world problems in animal management in particular today. So I am based at the University of Newcastle and cognition has been one of my research focuses over the last 15 years. So you can't start a lecture on animal cognition without first taking a few moments to figure out what we're talking about. What is actually cognition? So you can start intuitively, and when I ask students this question, often they'll tell me, well, it's something about mental processes. And that's a great place to start. And you might think, for example, of learning when you think cognition. And that seems something to do with cognition. But then if you start thinking a bit further, you think about things like emotions and motivation. They all seem to be processes that would take place in the brain or in the mind and should therefore be encompassed under cognition. But we don't generally intuitively tend to think that emotion has anything to do with cognition. So another perspective that's out there is that of psychologists. And psychologists are really characterized by the fact they make a very clear distinction between, well, what they think is clear, between associative learning and cognition being the more complex cognitive processes. So they view cognition as something complex from the mechanism perspective, and associative learning as simple cognition. So associative learning is simple and cognition is complex. And together, associative learning and cognition are what make up intelligence, animal intelligence, including humans, of course, since humans are also animals. Now, the problem with that definition is that it's far from clear that there is such a divide between associative learning or mechanisms that involve associative learning, which I'm going to be talking about in a few slides, as being simple, and then more complicated processes. And the issue that arises is that when you study cognition, any type of process that you want to call cognition involves demonstrating that it doesn't involve associative learning for it to be able to be considered cognition by a psychologist. You have to demonstrate that it doesn't involve associative learning. And in fact, demonstrating that something isn't involved is pretty much impossible. So biologists is the final perspective, and they basically sidestep all these problems about what does and doesn't constitute cognition by simply saying that cognition encompasses all processing mechanisms involved in environmental processing of environmental information, and includes perception, storing, and using information to make decisions. So they don't make any kind of distinction. It's just a broad basket into which they throw all mental processes, basically. Now, if you are interested in passing in cognition, reading more about cognition in more depth, then Sarah Shuttleworth's book here on the left is the Bible of Cognition. And by the time you've read this book, you'll know a lot more about cognition. Psychologists also endorse a very hierarchical view of the distribution of cognitive abilities across the taxonomic tree, which is basically draws upon a scala naturae view of diversity, of taxonomy. So they rank species from those that are capable of simple processes and organisms that are capable of much more complicated cognitive organisms. So at the bottom of this tree, you'll find things like invertebrates and spiders. And then you basically go up, perhaps to the amphibians that are a bit smarter, and then maybe the reptiles are a bit smarter than that. Who knows? And then you'd go to the mammals, and of course at the pinnacle of this tree, you go to the primates. And then, of course, there's us right at the top. We are the smartest of all. So it's a hierarchical ranking of organisms according to some underlying intuition that they are gradually more complicated in terms of their cognitive abilities and more capable of more complex cognitive abilities. So we share faculties that are phylogenetically old with all other animal organisms, and we've diverged more recently on more complex animal cognitive abilities. Now, this hierarchical view is not endorsed at all by biologists, because central to the thinking of biologists is evolution. So they view cognitive abilities, which they will often call cognitive traits, just like morphological traits. Cognitive processes are shaped by evolution, just like morphological traits. Species evolve in certain environments, and those environments have selected for the particular cognitive abilities that allow them to survive under those environmental conditions. So this diagram sort of illustrates this. You can see here the cognitive mechanisms that encompass things like perception, motivation, memories, this broad basket. Those cognitive mechanisms are what leads to behavior, it underpins behavior. Those behaviors have an immediate outcome, which influences fitness. And then, of course, surviving or not surviving, or passing on offspring or not, influences which genes are retained within the population. So the genes that underpin those cognitive mechanisms either remain within the population, or they're passed on to descendants, or they're removed from the population. And cognitive mechanisms change. So cognitive mechanisms change over time, and they're adapted to the environments in which the animals live through this interaction with the environment here. So they basically, they don't rank cognitive abilities on complexity. They simply acknowledge that some cognitive abilities are widely distributed across the taxonomic tree, and others are much more rare. But they put this down to particular environmental conditions that have selected for those cognitive abilities. They don't make any assumption about the ones being simple and the others being complex. They don't say that more rare cognitive abilities are actually more rare because they're complex. They simply assume that the environments that have, that only a few organisms have encountered the particular selection pressures that lead to the evolution of those particular cognitive abilities. So when we talk about generalized cognitive abilities, we're talking about associative learning, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute, but the rare ones are things like vocal learning. If you go into social cognition, you're talking about theory of mind, perspective taking. In physical cognition, we have things like tool making. Those cognitive abilities are considered to be specialized in the sense that they are rare across the taxonomic tree, because the environmental conditions that lead to their evolution have been rare. Whereas these generalized cognitive abilities, and I'm going to talk about associative learning, are much more widespread because they are basically adaptive to all organisms. So I really can't tell you about the applications of cognition without telling you a little bit about associative learning, because when you start talking about specialized cognitive abilities like vocal learning, there are some, I guess, in vocal learning. If you talk about song learning in birds, there are potentially some, like adaptation to urban environments now in the changing world, food caching, tool making. The applications have not been quite so widespread, but associative learning has had a huge number of applications. So I need to tell you a little bit about associative learning. So associative learning is considered a generalized cognitive ability. It's shared by all animal organisms, basically, from ants, spiders, sea slugs, all the way through to us. We all have this cognitive ability called associative learning. So associative learning is one form of learning. There are many different forms of learning, and associative learning is one of them. And what is particular about it is that it underpins changes in behavior that are underpinned by the formation of association. So associative learning, as the name says, involves the formation of an association. And that association can either be between two stimuli, between two events, and we call those a signal and an outcome. Or they can be, that association can be between a behavior and its consequences. And those, depending on the type of association, we call this either Pavlovian conditioning or instrumental conditioning. So let me tell you a little bit more about each of those processes so that you can understand how this particular family of category of cognitive abilities is used to solve real world problems. So let's start by talking about Pavlovian conditioning, which is also called classical conditioning. So what this cognitive ability involves is that a neutral stimulus, something that's initially neutral, which we call a conditioned stimulus, it doesn't elicit a response, it's neutral by definition, but it does after it's been presented together with something biologically significant. And that biologically significant stimulus is something we call an unconditioned stimulus. So Pavlovian conditioning, you might have heard of Pavlovian conditioning. This is the way it works. As I say, it's also called classical conditioning. They're just two interchangeable terms. But this is how it works. So Pavlov's dog is very famous. Pavlov won the Nobel Prize for this work. He was actually a digestive physiologist, and he actually discovered classical conditioning quite serendipitously. He set up an experiment, and he showed this process basically, which is summarized in this diagram. So what he showed was that before training, you can take a stimulus that is neutral, for example, a sound. It happened to be a metronome in the story, and present this sound to a dog, which was the system he worked with, and the dog doesn't salivate. But if you present food to the dog actually salivates when this food is in contact with its mouth. So he was studying digestive reflexes, and this makes sense because salivation to food is good, because saliva actually contains enzymes that breaks down the food already inside the mouth. So digestion starts inside the mouth, and that's why we salivate to food. And this is something that's hardwired. It's genetic. We don't learn it. It's just a reflex. So that food is what we call this unconditioned stimulus. So it's not conditioned, and the salivation is that unconditioned response. It's that reflex response. Then what he showed is that he could undergo a period of conditioning in which he presented this sound followed closely by food. So he took his dogs and he presented a sound, and then gave them a food dish. And he did this multiple times. So he waited for a while and then again presented the sound and followed closely by food. And what he showed was that the dog salivated, of course, to each of these paired presentations, but that's because there's food. What he surprisingly discovered was that after conditioning, he could play back this sound, and the animal salivated to the sound. So this was really groundbreaking in that time, because people at his time thought that reflexes were completely inflexible, so they could not change. We were born with these reflexes that were elicited by certain stimuli, and that was that. They couldn't be changed. And he showed that actually reflexes can come under the control of new stimuli in the environment. So that new stimulus is what we call the conditioned stimulus. It's the one that's learnt. So this is the process of classical conditioning. So classical conditioning, the result of classical conditioning is basically everywhere to be seen around us. I've said this is a general cognitive ability. We see it everywhere. It's very present in all fear and avoidance behavior. So people who have a fear of dogs, for example, if they've been bitten by a dog, then they've learned to fear dogs. So dogs is an initially neutral stimulus, but then they've been bitten. So that's the unconditioned stimulus. And as a result, they become afraid of dogs, which is the conditioned stimulus. That's a form of fear conditioning. People have the same sort of phobias towards spiders. And then people also show phobias towards sharks. So you might be thinking, well, we haven't all been bitten by a shark, and we haven't all had an aversive experience with spiders, although some of us have. So what's the story? How can this be learned fear? Well, it turns out that an unconditioned stimulus, that food in the original experiment, or being bitten by a dog, that unconditioned stimulus doesn't have to be something that you experience directly. It can be a social stimulus. So Meinicke showed a couple of decades ago now that with using rhesus monkeys, that rhesus monkeys that are bred in captivity don't have any fear of snakes. But if they watch their mothers expressing a fear response towards snakes, then they themselves become afraid of snakes. So they weren't bitten by the snake, they weren't injured, they weren't harmed. It's just that the fear response of their mums was the unconditioned stimulus that drove conditioning. And in humans, we know that children who have mums who are afraid of dogs are significantly more likely to have a fear of dogs. So conditioning can happen in the social world too. So this also happens, so it's not only about fear. You don't only learn fear through classical conditioning, you can learn food preferences. For example, Norway rats, very well studied system. If they experience a new food on the breath of a conspecific, it's actually a sulfur compound contained within the breath of the conspecific that is the unconditioned stimulus and drives learning about that new food. And they'll show a preference for that food that they've smelt on the breath of a conspecific, whether or not that conspecific was actually awake or asleep or even dead. As long as they smell that pairing, they'll acquire a food preference. Red-winged blackbirds, if you feed them out, if they watch their companion feeding out of a particularly coloured dish, then they'll show a preference for that dish colour at a later stage. So again, the pairing of a neutral stimulus, the colour, with a companion feeding, which is acting as an unconditioned stimulus. It's not only about food, it's not only about fear. You can condition sexual behaviour as well. And so this is my example. So this work has been done in Japanese quail, and the condition experience they've given these individuals is that they've allowed males to go into what they call a mating chamber. So a room where they encounter a female that is receptive, and they have the opportunity to copulate. And then what they've done is they've compared males that had previous experience mating in this room with males that didn't have this experience, this conditioning experience. And what they've found is that the males that had this conditioning experience release more sperm, and their females actually produce more fertilized eggs. So in comparison between the two males, the ones with and without experience, the males, the trained males actually end up fathering more young. So they have an advantage in terms of sperm competition, not only releasing more sperm, but actually their sperm going on to fertilize more eggs than the untrained males. And this is perhaps where I can give you a little bit more insight into classical conditioning and the fact that it's an association that is learned. What it is, in fact, that is learned is a predictive relationship. So the association is learned because the new stimulus functions as a signal for the upcoming important event. So the metronome in Pavlov's experiments functions as a signal for upcoming food. And what that allows the animal to do is to prepare itself in advance of that upcoming important event. So what these males have essentially learned is this chamber, because they have experience of this chamber, they can prepare themselves to mate, and that gives them the advantage when mating is actually available to them. So classical conditioning is actually learning about signals in the environment, be it a signal of a threat, or a signal for food, or a signal for a mating opportunity. Classical conditioning is about learning about these signals in the environment. And that is why it's so widespread, is because it's important for the survival of all organisms to be able to learn about signals in advance of important events, so we can prepare ourselves and better cope with them. For example, in the terms of threat, we can respond to the call of a predator in so far that we can run away, or we can freeze, whatever it takes to avoid that predator. We don't have to wait until the predator is actually holding us in its claws to respond. We've responded in advance because we've learned that vocal cue, which might have been initially neutral, is a signal for that upcoming threat. So that's sexual behavior. Here's another example in blue gourami fish. What they do here in this conditioning experiment is they give the male fish a signal, so a light, they flash a light, and then they give access to a receptive female. And these males are what we call the paired males, because they receive the signal, the light signal and the receptive female together. And they compare this with unpaired males. So these are ones that have been trained slightly differently. They've received the light and the receptive. So they've experienced light presentations. They've experienced opportunities to mate with a receptive female, but always widely separated in time. So one isn't a signal for the other. And when they then compare the behavior of these males towards female, the male that was prepared because it had learnt the light, actually exhibits less bites, more courtship behaviour, they spawn sooner, and they father 10 times more offspring than the unpaired males. So basically what they've learned is that this light is the signal of an upcoming mating opportunity, so they can prepare themselves. So that's why, and that preparation is evident in here. It's obvious that it has great fitness advantages to be prepared, and that's why the mechanisms that underpin classical conditioning are then passed on to the descendants of these fish that have the capacity to learn about these signals. That's how classical conditioning has evolved. And in my last example, we've seen learning about food, we've seen learning about threats, we've seen learning in the context of mating opportunities, and this is also in aggressive behavior. Classical conditioning plays a role. So this time they show gourami fish a light, but instead of getting a receptive female, this time they get an intruding male. And the way males respond to intruder males is they attack them because they defend their territory. So they get, again, there are paired and unpaired males. Paired males get the light followed by the intruder, whereas the unpaired males get the light and the intruder separately. And what they then do is they take a paired male and an unpaired male, they show them the light, and then they let them fight. And it turns out that the paired males are much more likely to win. So again, they've learned that the light is an upcoming signal for a fight. So they can prepare themselves in advance, and that allows them the advantage. So here again, you can see the fitness benefit of being able to learn, to be able to classical conditioning and condition and learn about signals in advance of them. So this brings me to the second associative learning process, which is instrumental conditioning. So again, it's associative learning, so it involves learning and association, but this time it's between a behavior and a consequence, as opposed to an association between a signal and an outcome, or a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So in instrumental conditioning, is what we call also operant conditioning. The two terms are used interchangeably. A behavior is followed by a consequence, and that's where the association is. The behavior and the consequence are associated, and as a result, the frequency of that behavior changes. So instrumental conditioning, this learning process, has been extensively studied in an experimental paradigm referred to as the Skinner box, which you might have heard of. It's probably the most published widespread psychology paradigm, and it essentially involves a rat in a small chamber. Skinner is the name of the psychologist who developed the paradigm. So the rodent, or sometimes pigeons, they are housed individually in a small room, and they don't have much to do other than press a lever. So they can press this lever here that you can see, and what is also attached to this chamber is a container of food. And what the experimenter can do is set up a relationship between the animal pressing the lever and a food item being delivered here into the food trough. So the experimenter basically sets up an association between a behavior, which is pressing the lever, and a consequence, which is whether or not the animal gets food. Another consequence that can be set up in this chamber is the animal is standing on a foot grid here that can be used to deliver a mild electric shock to the animal's feet, called a foot shock. So imagine that it's a bit like you touching a shopping trolley, and it zaps you. So it's a bit like that. And that allows the experimenter to study instrumental conditioning. And essentially what it involves is that when the animal presses the lever, it will get food. The effect of that is that the frequency of lever pressing will increase. That is essentially instrumental conditioning. So the animal learns that when it lever presses, it gets food. And as a consequence of that association being learnt, it lever presses more. If, in contrast, the experimenter sets up an association where when the animal lever presses, it gets a foot shock, then the animal learns that association. I lever press, I get a foot shock, which I don't like. As a consequence of that, the frequency of lever pressing decreases. And that's essentially instrumental conditioning. Now, instrumental conditioning is widespread in all animal behavior. There are many, many of our behaviors that are shaped by instrumental conditioning. They're shaped by relationships between what we do and the consequences of what we do. So think about education. You go into a classroom, a child that's talking gets some time out, for example. So talking is hopefully going to decrease. A child that works hard on their homework gets praise, so they're going to the effort they put into things is going to keep going or increase. It's used in law enforcement. So if you do something wrong, you go through a red light, you get a big fine and your license withdrawn. You are probably not going to go through a red light again, hopefully. So that's also instrumental conditioning. It's also used, of course, throughout our interactions with animals, and these are already applications. In fact, if you go to any dolphin show, or you have a dog and you train it to do tricks, then you're using instrumental conditioning, basically. And here are a couple of videos. I'm not going to show them here. You can do that in your own time. But there are a couple of examples of instrumental conditioning being used in the real world. One to manage the husbandry requirements of large, dangerous zoo animals, and the other to train assistance dogs. So these are great videos, and I recommend you look at them to just become more familiar with that instrumental conditioning idea. So I'm going to move on now from to talking about some of the applications of some of this research in animal cognition. And it really is about the applications of associative learning, essentially, because there are far more applications of associative learning than there are of any of the other types of cognitive abilities that exist out there. And I could talk about lots of things, but I'm going to talk about my work on learning about novel threats. And here's my website if you want to read up on any of this literature that's on the topics I'm going to tell you about today. So I have worked with the common myna, also you might know it as the Indian myna. It's a bird that's been introduced to Australia from Southeast Asia. It's spread across the East Coast, and it's now one of the most common species in our cities on the East Coast. And many people consider it a pest. It is thought to compete for hollows with our natives, and just a nuisance. And so there's been a lot of trapping of this species. But it also happens to be that it's a very flexible species. It adapts very well to captivity. So it's a species that's very well suited to captive experiments on cognition. And I worked early on social learning about predators in this species. And one of my earliest findings was to show that common mynas are capable of being conditioned to recognize novel predators. I showed this simply by measuring their vigilance response to a novel stimulus. It happened to be a pheasant, taxidermy mount of a pheasant, and they really didn't care much about this pheasant. But then I exposed them to one association of this pheasant and an unconditioned stimulus. And that unconditioned stimulus that I used was a playback recording of a distress call. So distress call, here you can see the spectrogram. It's a pulsatile broadband vocalization, which is essentially a repeated shriek, very piercing, very unpleasant, that the birds give when they are held by a predator, captured by a predator, and in particular by a human. So they're pretty easily recorded. So I gave them one paired presentation of this pheasant with a couple of minute playback of this sound, and then again measured their response to the novel predator, to this pheasant, and they became significantly more wary of it, much more vigilant in its presence. Now that is a form of socially conditioned predator avoidance. It's not totally novel in birds. It has been shown before, and what we also know is that this type of learning can be enhanced by using not only calls as an unconditioned stimulus, but also dead birds, in fact, can trigger this type of conditioning. So I've recently worked with engineers from the University of Sydney who were interested in designing a drone to protect vineyards against pest birds. Now, the problem with any type of technique that tries to protect vineyards against pest birds is that the birds habituate to any type of technique we use. So people use loud sounds like gunshots or broadband sounds, or shining things that dangle in the wind, but the birds tend to habituate. So they last for maybe a little bit, but then they certainly don't work anymore. And the problem with a drone is that possibly we might fly a drone over them and they don't like the drone, but then they might habituate to the drone. So the idea was to try and get them to learn about this drone, learn that this drone is a predator that can occasionally attack. And it's that occasional attack that is very important to learning that this is a predator. Not just that this is a disturbance stimulus that one can habituate to, but this is a predator and one shouldn't habituate to it because there's always a risk that it will attack. So how do you convey this? Well, you have to teach the pest birds that this is a predator. And the way you do that is you set it up to make it look like that it's predated upon a bird. So we did this by attaching a dead raven to the drone when we flew it over the pest birds, and also playing back the distress call. So essentially what we're telling the pest birds is this, we're conditioning the pest birds by essentially conveying the message that this drone has attacked a bird that is now shrieking in distress and pretty much dead. So in that way, we're trying to trigger learning about this drone as if it's a predator, so that we don't get habituation in the long term. And these are some very small scale results that have been done in the field, and which are currently being expanded to test more longer term learning. But there were 3 experiments conducted, and this is the percentage of reduction in silver eyes in particular in the 15 minutes after the drone had been flown relative to before the drone was flown. And you can see that there's between a 40 and 95% reduction in silver eye activity. So we've certainly succeeded in scaring the silver eyes. Now what we need to be doing is to be looking at this longer term retention of the predator, taking that dead raven off and not playing the calls, and making sure that the birds are maintaining their responses to the drone, and then occasionally put this raven back on and the calls back on, so that we get a periodic simulated attack by this drone. And we'll see whether that maintains avoidance. This is a type of application of the knowledge we have about social learning, of the capacity of birds to learn socially about predators. The other result that I showed in early work on common miners was that they learn about dangerous places. So here you see the experimental setup, which was a couple of cages, what we call the home cage and the experimental cage. And the birds was released to into the home cage on the left, and then it could pass into the cage on the right through a tunnel. And what we showed here, where the bottom image is actually the wrong way around compared with the top image, but basically here the bird, a focal bird is here on the right, and what it's seeing is a human chase another bird in this cage with a handheld net. And so we gave this observational experience to the birds, and what we did to measure whether it learned anything about this was we measured its latency and willingness to enter this cage to forage. So before this condition experiments, we measured its latency and how much it was willing to go into this, from its home cage into the second cage to forage from a foraging tray. Then we gave it this conditioning experience where they watched this human with a handheld net chase another bird and catch it and remove it. And then we again measured, we asked, is the bird wary of going to forage in this other cage? And what we found was it is indeed wary of this cage. It becomes much more wary. So it had learned, in fact, about a place by observing the capture of another individual. And this is the finding that we've expanded now into the field. So we have taken a look. So as I mentioned, common miners are the subject of a lot of trapping in Australia. And we did a large-scale survey, and we showed that between the years of 2004 and 2012, when you ask volunteer groups and local government programs how many miners they've actually killed and trapped and killed, we got to a number of about 84,000 birds had been trapped in this time period. So that's a lot of birds. That's a heavy selection pressure on these birds. So what we're essentially interested in asking is whether common miners are actually showing compensatory responses to this very heavy level of, well, selection, or it could be selection, but it's certainly an evolutionary pressure. So are they basically responding to this heavy level of human predation, was the question we were interested in. So to get at this question, we actually selected areas across Sydney and Canberra. We selected areas where miners had been very heavily trapped and areas where they had been less trapped. And a PhD student of mine called Marie Dicalou studied the birds in the field and asked the question of whether they differed in their behaviour. So there were essentially, in the experiment, there were 9 localities, 4 with high trapping pressure, 5 with low trapping pressure, and 33 areas. We did lots of abundance counts, lots of transects, lots of point counts, and about 1,000 field observations on common miners. And what we found was that common miners in highly trapped areas are found closer to cover. They're found in smaller groups. They're significantly more likely to be in locomotion, which is a measure of wariness in common miners, and they are essentially less detectable during transect. So you're more likely not to see them in these heavily trapped areas. So there is evidence, we found evidence basically in the field that in areas where miners are being heavily trapped, they are changing their behavior. And the question we asked was, how is behavioral change occurring? So there are a couple of possible mechanisms, proximate mechanisms behind these behavioral changes. It could be that what we're doing is a form of selective removal, a form of selective harvesting. So the birds that are trap friendly, that trapping is usually what's done. The birds that are trap friendly are going into the traps and being removed. So trap friendliness, if it has any kind of genetic underpinning, those genes are being removed from the population, and what we're basically left behind with is birds that are trap cautious and don't go into the traps anymore. And of course, the problem with these compensatory responses, we'll end up not being able to trap common miners if they compensate too much. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that. We've tested the personalities of individuals that go into traps and those that don't, and basically we haven't found any evidence of that kind of change, that kind of selective removal, that entering traps is personality biased in any way. We haven't found evidence of that. So the other possibility is a cognitive mechanism that involves, of course, learning of the type of mechanism that I'd already found that common miners are capable of. At the time, there was one other demonstration that birds could learn in the field, classical condition to predators, and that was shown in ravens. So a corvid, which is supposed to be highly intelligent. Nobody had shown anything in songbirds. So we asked the question, were common miners actually learning about traps? And that's why they were learning about predators and predation and human predation. And that's why they were they were showing these compensatory responses. So we set up an experiment in the field to ask whether common miners learn socially about traps, and what exactly do they learn? Do they learn about the place, or do they learn about the person who's trapping them? So these are essentially cognition questions, and it's important to know these things if we want to try and change, to change the way we control miners to avoid this type of learning taking place. Well, we need to know how they are actually learning and what is important to their learning. So what we did was Marie Dicalou conducted a study in the field. She set up about 14 foraging sites of miners, in which she attracted wild common miners to come and feed at this foraging location. And once they willingly came to feed, we did an experiment. We started a procedure in which she fed for 8 consecutive days. And 4 days, on 4 of those days, she wore a mask and a costume, and 4 of those days, she just wore her normal clothes. And those were alternate days. And of course, the birds don't really care who's feeding them at that point, so they come to forage to both these to both these experimenters, basically. That was 8 days. 1 day we feed with the costume, 1 day we don't, 4 days each. And then what we did is we implemented that technique we'd found in captivity, which is we gave them a trapping demonstration where we showed them, basically, we took a cage out there, which would be the equivalent of a trap. We had common miners in it, and birds that were free-ranging birds visiting this foraging site watched an experimenter catch birds inside this cage with a handheld net, exactly what we'd done in captivity. And while the experimenter was doing this with this handheld net, we also played back these distress calls. And we did that at 7 sites with the costume and 7 sites without the costume to make sure that we didn't systematically pair the costume with something aversive to them. So we didn't want any effect to be due to the costume or no costume. So we counterbalanced the use of the costume across the trapping demonstrations. This was just one demonstration at the foraging site. And then we repeated the pre-demonstration phase, where for 8 days Marie went back to the site every morning and fed, and on 4 of those days she wore the costume and 4 of them she didn't. Now the question is, what are the birds learning about? So it's possible, so if we count the number of miners that are willing to land at this foraging site, and we look at before the demonstration and after the demonstration, well, it's possible they learn absolutely nothing. And if that's the case, then we should see the same number of birds before landing at the site before the demonstration as afterwards. And I'm just going to make a slight change to this slide and I'll be right back. Okay, so that essentially looks much better. I'm not sure why the colors had been changed there in that slide, but I've just changed them back. So back to this argument about this reasoning about the predictions, whether the animals, whether the birds are actually learning anything in this conditioning experiment. So as I said, it could be that they're learning nothing. And if so, if we count the number of birds that are willing to land at this foraging site before and after training, there should be no conditioning, there should be no difference. And that shouldn't also matter whether it's the safe demonstrator that was never paired with, that was never seen to be catching birds inside the cage, or the dangerous demonstrator, the one that the birds did see catching bird inside the cage. There should be no difference between the two. So if the birds learn nothing, this is what we should find. No difference from before to afterwards, and also no difference across the 2 demonstrators. It could, however, be that the birds are learning about the place, in which case, if you count the number of birds that land at the location, then we should find lots of birds that land beforehand and fewer birds that land afterwards. But if they're learning about the place, then they don't care which demonstrator they saw, which demonstrator they saw catch the birds. It shouldn't matter. So birds' numbers should be reduced to both the demonstrators after conditioning. However, if they learn about the person, then what we should see is that there are lots of birds before, independent of who feeds them, and afterwards they should come when the safe demonstrator feeds them, but not when the dangerous demonstrator comes, the one that was seen to be catching the birds during the conditioning experience. They shouldn't come to them. So that would tell us they're learning about the person. So what did we actually find? So this is the number of birds that land at the patch. Again, a problem with the colors here, but the safe demonstrator is in green, the dangerous demonstrator is in orange, as per the previous slides. And what we found is that indeed the number of birds that land at the patch was reduced after conditioning relative to before. So it demonstrates the birds have learned about the place, just as we had found in captivity. They don't want to come back. They've seen something dangerous happen there and they are cautious, but there's no difference towards the 2 demonstrators. However, if you look at their, you can also look at their latency to land. So this is the percentage of trials with no landing, and as a function of latency. So 0 is when the food is put down at the foraging site, and this is when the birds start to land. So there are fewer and fewer trials, basically, over the repetition of all these sites. There are fewer and fewer trials where no birds have landed at, say, 500 seconds after the food has been put down. So if you look at the results before conditioning and after conditioning, pre and post, you can see that the birds are landing at the foraging site much faster before conditioning than after conditioning. So if you look at 1,000 seconds after the food has been put down, then there are almost no trials where there are almost no trials where birds have not landed. Whereas after conditioning, there are still, about 30% of trials, no birds have landed at the site yet. But again, there was no difference between the safe and the dangerous demonstrator. It didn't matter who was feeding them, the birds took longer to land. But now what we looked at was we also looked at the number of calls, the number of alarm calls. And what we found is that before conditioning, there are a certain number of alarm calls produced, relatively low. But after conditioning, there was no increase in the number of alarm calls produced in the presence of the safe demonstrator here in green, but a huge increase in the number of alarm calls produced towards the dangerous demonstrator. And that shows that the birds actually know which human of the two that are feeding them was the one that was seen to be removing the birds from the trap. So in conclusion, miners learn socially to avoid a place where they've witnessed trapping, and they also know about the person that has handled the traps. And this has some very important implications for trapping in Australia, because this learning, this cognitive ability to learn about dangerous places and dangerous people will produce a decrease in trapping success over time. More and more birds are going to learn, and they will presumably socially transmit it to other birds within the population, possibly parents to their offspring, also horizontally from adult to adult. What we've also shown is that we're getting biased evaluations of program effectiveness, because what's happening in areas where the birds are highly trapped is that the birds are becoming more cryptic, so they're more difficult to detect. So what might happen is that we go in and we count the number of birds, we go in and trap, and then we go in again and we say there are no more birds there. But in fact, what's happened is the birds have become more cryptic. So we're over-evaluating the effectiveness of the trapping program. And what might also happen with this type of learning, and there is evidence to suggest that this is the case, birds are actually, through this type of learning, avoiding the areas immediately around the trap. And what that means is that they might start avoiding areas where trapping is intense, and those areas are generally in the suburbs. Now, where can the birds go from the suburbs? Well, they can go, if they're avoiding them, they can go into the city, but that might not be appropriate because they can't find enough food, or they might find those heavily urbanized environments aversive. But there's certainly less trapping there. What they might also do is push into the bush, so into more pristine areas where in fact they'll end up competing more with the natives. So we have, so now what has happened is the application of this work is that we have consulted with the trapping communities across Australia, and a trapping recommendation now is to never approach a trap during the day. So we know, in fact, from the work in captivity, that what triggers learning is the association of the dangerous human and the fearful conspecific. So what needs to be avoided to make sure that learning doesn't happen is that onlooking birds never see a human scaring common miners inside the trap. So our recommendation to the trapping community, and this has been implemented, is to approach traps only after dark when there are no onlooking birds. And this will reduce the occurrence of this type of learning. So with that, I hope I've given you a tiny taste of cognition and its applications to pest management in particular. showing how the more we understand about animals' cognitive processes, the more we can try to solve real-world problems, thinking about the way animals process, learn about, and use information from their environment. Of course, animal cognition doesn't only have applied implications, it's also fascinating. It's a window into the evolution of our own minds. And for that just for that reason, it's worthy of conserving species, because when we lose species through biodiversity loss, we also lose a window into our own minds.